Hello and welcome to today's patron webinar featuring Golin on the great Rethink, navigating CEO communications in an era of increased complexity. This event is part of our Page Patron series, which is designed to showcase cutting-edge insights and solutions that can help you advance your organization's communication goals. Golin has sponsored today's session to share findings from their latest CEO Impact Index. We're very delighted to be joined by Sarah Vellozzi, the Managing Director of U.S. Corporate Affairs at Golin, and someone you all probably know very well, Brian Besanceney, a Senior Advisor at Golin, and also former Communications Executive at Boeing, Walmart, and the White House. And without further ado, let's please welcome Sarah to kick off our call today.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'll jump right in. So, the way that we'd like to structure this call is to quickly take you through the highlights of our most recent study, which covers the first half of 2025. And then Brian and I will talk a little bit about these results. And then, of course, we're going to open it up so that we get more questions, feedback, discussion based on what the insights are telling us. And so to quickly ground you and what the CEO Impact Index is, it is a large data science study developed by Golin in partnership with our data and analytics and corporate affairs team to unpack the specific dynamics of CEO visibility for the top 250 CEOs in the Fortune 500. And so we undertake this research every 6 months. We started in 2023, and this is now our fourth iteration of the research. And, what we do is that we look at these 8 different dimensions of CEO positioning and give an individual score for each. And then we use a proprietary weighting system to rank the overall index and come up with an overall ranking. We also, in a commitment to understanding really what is the ROI and impact of CEO visibility, we do a secondary analysis to track our index ranking with actual business performance, including revenue growth and annual share price dimensions, et cetera. And so, just to ground you also in what are those 8 dimensions specifically, it was important to us in setting up this research that it didn't just look at a traditional earned media lens or a social media lens, but that we took a comprehensive view of the ways that CEOs engage publicly today. And so earned visibility is obviously an important anchor of what we study, but we also look at LinkedIn presence as the premium B2B forum for social engagement. We also look at awards and ranking profiles. How do these CEOs show up and their companies, the companies that they lead, show up in the major accredited rankings? Employee engagement is also an important indicator of internal success, culture, and the sort of overall reputation that these CEOs are building. We look at major events, including the large global leadership forums like Davos and Milken and Aspen, but also trade-specific events like CES for the technology space or JP Morgan for pharmaceuticals. Megatrends is the space where we really dig into what are the largest narratives and conversations driving the business community in any 6-month period. And we kind of look at this like a basket of top trending topics. And what has been interesting for us to see is that they evolve pretty rapidly in every 6-month window. And it gives us a sense of how close are these CEOs to really either driving thought leadership or setting the pulse of the major conversations that are taking out. And then trade engagement reflects trade presence and associations and forums, but also the trade media exposure that is important to industry conversations. And finally, overall CEO sentiment is our check and balance in the overall 8 metrics to make sure that the CEO Impact Index is not just a shouting match and a volume game, but a quality assessment too. Do these CEOs ultimately hold a favorable positive perception or a negative one? And what can we glean from that exposure? So with that, let's talk about the context of the window of time that we are looking at, this first half of 2025. And, we've all lived through this. You guys have lived through this too. 2025 has been a severe testing ground for CEOs. First and foremost, the arrival of the second Trump administration definitely had a strong impact on overall CEO focus and visibility. But with that, we also saw this continuing momentous push from AI and AI adoption across the economy. that is forcing, many organizations in the tech sector, but well beyond tech sector, to communicate what their adoption and what their investment plans are and how this transformative technology is impacting their businesses. Um, in this environment, what we're seeing is an intense, high stakes, and very fragmented media environment that is increasingly polarizing. And so CEOs are navigating an interesting space where there's traditional news forums that enable them to communicate on business developments, on earnings, on other important moments in their business life cycle. But there's also an entire echo chamber that is existing in social media, and CEOs in particular are polarizing sort of lightning rods for discussion and public conversation. And so we're seeing that magnifying effect in overall CEO perception, and it's accelerated by anti-corporate sentiment, other things that are happening out in the social space. In this context, what we've seen is that the CEO role itself has never been more precarious. And right now, there is an accelerated volume of CEO exits in the U.S. Public holdings, publicly held companies, one that is unprecedented historically and has caused many very dramatic changes within the organizations that they lead to absorb these sudden shifts and communicate forward. So with all of these things together, what we're seeing is that 2025 is a moment of the great rethink. And it's not just the great rethink on CEO communications, but really everything, the prioritization of business topics, the way that we think about transitions, the prioritization of workforce communications. And so I'm going to quickly take you through what the key findings from this window are, and then we'll talk about them in more detail. So our first insight is what we're calling the cone of retreat. And this is a rethink on public engagement that we observe very clearly from the data for CEOs in this first half of 2025. And the interesting context is that the year started actually with a lot of optimism from the business community overall. I think there was generally a sense that, all right, a second term is more familiar territory than a first. And there was anticipation that the new administration would come in with pro-business policies, maybe some openness to mergers and acquisitions, to deals getting done. And so there was, I would say, a favorable rise of media coverage and commentary in this pre-inauguration window. However, what we saw was that very quickly, the start of this Trump administration had a profound cooling effect on CEOs. And this is what we're talking about, this cone of retreat. Very large swell of overall CEO exposure in the run-up to the inauguration, and then a dramatic narrowing. And so typically in every 6-month period that we look at, there's sort of a uniform volume of overall CEO earned exposure. And this was a uniquely different pattern that we had ever seen before. Altogether, more than 50% of overall CEO exposure for the 250 CEOs we studied occurred just in 2 months, in January and in April, the inauguration moment and the reaction to the tariff announcements in April. And within that, what we saw is that there was this emergence of super negative CEOs. And when I talk about super negative CEOs, what I mean are those CEOs that had more than a -10 score, specifically on the CEO sentiment score that we have. And this was uncharacteristic to anything that we had seen in our previous studies, statistically not a normal variance. And what it signaled to us was that CEO communications had clearly entered a period of extreme volatility, and that overall sentiment is not just a metric that stands alone, it's actually a multiplier. If a CEO finds themselves in a very favorable or a very unfavorable moment in this period of time, it had net impacts across their overall thought leadership scores, their earned visibility, their trade engagement, their employee sentiment. And so, this was so fascinating for us when we unpacked who was in those 21 super negative CEOs. They were predominantly in industries that were directly impacted by the tariffs and caught in a position where they had to publicly explain the impact of the tariffs on their business. This was the red thread across this group of 21. But in addition, those CEOs that sort of publicly spoke out and addressed the White House directly, in contrast to the tariffs, saw negative scores. There were also those CEOs that overly aligned with the White House and then also suffered reputation impacts, particularly in that social media echo chamber system. And so, just giving a better visual on this cone of retreat, at its peak in advance of the inauguration, the volume of CEO visibility was 2.5 times what it was for the remainder, the average of the remainder of the 6 months. So a very new environment. And, through the CEO Impact Index, we don't publish the individual CEO scores and disclose sort of private details. We keep that confidential. But we do have the ability to unpack specific industries and sectors, and we align with the Fortune system of categorization. And so, the question is, all right, great, like this is a high stakes, fast-paced environment. Who's doing well? Who's not doing well? And what we saw is that for the 4th time running, technology and media are remaining at the top. They are the best of the best in the CEO index ranking so far. This is a combination of a lot of momentum and growth associated with AI and AI adoption and the impacts it has across the economy, and also just sort of the mainstream implications of the way that transformation is changing content systems, the way that people consume information, entertainment, et cetera. Within the other industries that fared well, what we saw were some of those more, I would say, safer industries that are somewhat static and predictable. So materials, industrials, engineering, construction, energy, saw some net gains in this period. And the biggest losers, those that fell from the second half of 2024 into the first half of 2025, were again, those industries that were directly impacted by tariffs or other significant policy changes and were caught having to react and respond in real time about what the impacts to their business, what it meant for their customers, what it meant for supply chains, et cetera. So you can see retail, aerospace, automotives seeing some pretty significant loss in this period. So the second priority is this rethink on priorities. And so, with this context, I think it is probably no surprise that policy conversations came to the top of the list for CEOs in the first half of 2025. And what we saw was that 26% of CEO media coverage specifically referenced the Trump administration in this period of time, which was a 600% increase from direct references to the Biden administration in the previous 6 months. This focus on policy came to the top in a way that was systemic, but also very specific and increased around that window of the tariffs. The tariff announcement was certainly the biggest driver of commentary and reaction from CEOs in this period of time. And what is interesting, like in the context of the mega trends that we track, this is the first time since we started doing this research in 2023 that we saw both sustainability and climate, as well as DEI, completely fall out of the megatrends. And we don't pick the megatrends. We use AI to be able to evaluate and quantify what those top emerging topics are. And so we thought this was a significant development. And it's not so much that these companies deprioritized or stopped talking about these topics, but what we saw is that they moved away from the CEO talk track and into other executives, whether it's a CISO or other internal executives to take the lead voice on those topics. The third insight is the rethink on workforce. And this is interesting because AI has continued to be a top dominating megatrend topic for CEOs over the time that we've been studying the index. But the conversation has evolved pretty significantly. In 2023, it was about the investment race and sort of who was committing what dollars to quickly get on the train on AI adoption and investment. Then we saw last year pretty much a conversation about application and use cases and how companies were actually adapting and applying AI to benefit efficiency and workforce and customer experience. In 2025, the conversation has shifted to agentic AI, and this really equals a conversation about workforce implications and what net impacts this has on human versus robotic um, uh, uh, workforce. And what we saw is that, earned media conversation on AI specifically has always been sort of a cross-cutting current among the tech CEOs, but we saw a 36% increase in that conversation among non-tech CEOs, just further signaling that this is systemic enterprise, economy level conversation. And when we looked at the overall sentiment of these CEOs that have been digging into the workforce implication conversations, we definitely saw an interesting dynamic. Those CEOs that paired their AI investment conversations with comprehensive workforce development, retraining programs, investments in reskilling, job training, and et cetera, definitely saw a net benefit in their overall sentiment scores in the index and therefore higher ranks overall. Those CEOs that really took a more cut and dry approach to connect AI advancement with layoffs rather than strategic workforce transformation definitely saw a net negative impact in their overall sentiment. So this is a really fast emerging space and something that we're studying on an ongoing basis. But the other thing that was really interesting is this idea that the time the CEOs have to build equity, to build reputation and defend it is getting compressed pretty significantly. And so, as I mentioned, we are seeing an acceleration of exits in the CEO role, like in an unprecedented level. And what we saw just among the Fortune 250 was that 27 CEOs exited their role from the previous review period into the current, and another 7 that were in co-CEO roles left those jobs. And so altogether, that's 14% of the Fortune 250, an incredible number. And, what we see is that these transitions in old days, maybe there was succession planning, there was more of a runway. They're getting faster and tighter. And it's hard enough to be a CEO. It's even harder to be a rescue CEO. And so those CEOs that came in, when we looked at them versus tenured sort of like multi-year CEOs, they had significantly lower numbers across all 8 dimensions that we studied. And, I think that what our statistical analysis tells us is that the half-life of reputation advantages is getting compressed from years to months. It used to be that a misstep for a CEO, let's say in the first 6 months of their of taking office, could take some points on their overall positioning and reputation. But now we're seeing that those missteps could actually cost careers. And whether it's boards, investors, workforce themselves, the expectation level is so high. And so we're seeing that there's this need to sort of act quickly and plan those first 100 days, get out with speed. The data shows us that in the case of any sort of reputation question or attack, you have 90 days to really get up and address it. If not, then the overall net impact on reputation could be 18 to 36 months. It's a very long tail life. So finally, what does this all mean? Our 5th insight is that what we're seeing is a fundamental rethink on CEO positioning overall. I think, 5 years ago, 3 years ago, we saw a sense that CEOs often wanted to be a little bit of everywhere, right? This idea of ubiquity. They want to be on the big stages and also in the top business broadcast outlets, et cetera. And this is definitely a moment of reconsideration. Altogether, the CEOs that we studied saw 1 trillion impression decrease from the previous period. And in particular, the engagement with top tier media has reduced, while the chatter on X, and X is by far the most toxic environment for CEOs, grew pretty significantly by about 10 points from the previous 6 months. That said, we do see that emphasis on controlled, owned mechanisms, those that are strategically focus on specific stakeholder audiences are still paying dividends for CEOs. And so LinkedIn, as a platform for thought leadership and employee engagement, saw an uptick in this period, as well as event engagement. And this events thought leadership nexus is really a very powerful strategy for CEOs, because having thought leadership, bringing it to events, increases media coverage, it increases trade engagement, it increases overall net sentiment. And so it can be a very powerful strategy in the overall playbook. So what does this all mean? The report that we're going to distribute after this really unpacks very specific takeaways across these 5 insights to help think about looking at the remainder of 2025 and into 2026. But I'm going to stop sharing so that we can actually talk now. Brian has the benefit of C-suite perspective, being in the hot seat and thinking through many of these challenging dynamics. And so we're going to have a little bit of a conversation about that. Let me take a broad.
The benefit is this set of gray hairs, basically. Yeah.
All right. So, Brian, given the cone of retreat and what we're seeing in this new, very policy-centric environment, do you think what does this tell us, that CEOs should just lay low during the current administration?
Yeah, I think the words that come to mind for me are precision is one of the words. I think, and you guys call it out in the report, I think you want to be more precise in terms of what you're trying to communicate and where you're trying to communicate it. So I think being very kind of broad brush, being ubiquitous, things like that might not necessarily be the right, place for you to be, or sort of that kind of broad brush, comments about things in the political space. I think another 2 words that pop into my mind are politics versus policy. I think to the degree that you're seeing, CEOs weigh in with an informed view on policy issues and how it relates to their business and their customers, they tend to be a little better off than when they're perceived as straying into the political space. And so, the analogy I've thought to myself is about, like if you're driving this car down the expressway, the volume button was the thing that everyone or the knob was the thing that everyone twisted. But really, maybe the channel, knob is the one that you should be playing with a little bit more. Maybe being more precise in terms of where you're showing up, what types of issues you're weighing in on, and things like that is probably the right play.
Okay, and I mean, there are so many issues still sort of hanging around, whether it's the sustained government shutdown, a second round of tariffs. What advice would you give to CEOs right now that want to engage specifically on policy issues?
Yeah, I think think about this again from a channel perspective. What's the outcome you're trying to get? What audiences you're trying to reach? Lots more parties and stakeholders are watching your earnings call to see what you're going to say about that stuff. And we saw a lot of examples of that this year, where people's earnings calls became maybe a little more complex, not from an investor relations perspective, but, maybe from a government relations perspective. So I think about staying tight with your government relations colleagues. Sometimes that's the right channel to offer feedback on policy issues, at least doing it first, rather than doing it through, maybe a media interview or something like that. And again, trying to couch when you are weighing in on these issues, couch it in terms of business impact, jobs, investment in the United States, impact on your customers. Those are all safer territories than being on this other end of the spectrum where you're being perceived as sort of being quote unquote political.
Right. It's definitely tricky. In this context of high stakes, high velocity, more polarizing environments to navigate, net looking beyond policy issues, what do you see as the takeaways or the imperatives for CEOs in 2026?
I think, in some ways it's never been more important for CEOs to be effective spokespeople. And you mentioned it earlier, but I think, especially the ones that have a particular agenda. It could be an industry agenda. It could be the things that they're really prioritizing in terms of their company. I think the CEOs weighing in on those types of issues has never been, more important. But again, just trying to think through again, how do you maintain that volume? How do you continue to fulfill that need to engage your stakeholders, both your internal stakeholders and your external stakeholders, without being overexposed, without violating the Hippocratic Oath and running too much risk. And so this kind of balancing act of being smart and precise, is going to be really, really important for CEOs. You mentioned earlier the statistics are pretty overwhelming in terms of the tenures are coming down. Um, and that trend looks like it's going to continue, here for the foreseeable future, just because these jobs, more and more, stress and complication has been, put into them. So I think, again, continue to think about all the different, kind of levers and channels that you have. I think business leaders have not fully embraced, their chief communications officer, their chief corporate affairs officer roles. You're continuing to see that trend of those jobs getting more and more weight on them. That's good for us as a profession, net, but it's a lot of responsibility in the near to midterm as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the lived experience for many of the clients that we serve has been, a sudden change equals also a change of many strategic roles under the CEO, and so immediately a change in CFO and CMO and CCO, and the disruption and the lapse in communication clarity that happens in the wake of that can be very complicated to navigate. And
average tenure of a CCO now, I think, is 3.75 years. I saw a report on that last year. So I mean, that's that's and these jobs are exquisitely sensitive to the CEO transition.
Yeah. So another thing, in this context of being precise and really focusing on the right moments to engage, something that we've heard repeatedly is also a rising concern about the safety and security of CEOs and their public engagement. Like, what's your point of view on where we are with that?
Yeah, I think this is one of the things that's really trended through 2026. This is a conversation that's happening in boardrooms as well as in the C-suite. And, obviously we all know what happened last December here in New York, but also what happened, at the NFL and I think Blackstone, a few months ago, just a few blocks from here. And I think so that relationship between the chief communications officer and the however it's wired, the CISO or the chief security officer type of role, those entities have always had the need to collaborate and interact. But I think that that's clearly trending. It's coming up in a lot of different conversations within the CCO community. And so again, striking that balance act, being smart, about, making sure that, the chief security officer is fully, read into different things the CEO is planning to do. Maybe being smart about how long in advance you're advertising certain availabilities and things like that. I know last year there was a big move, toward the end of the year to take down people's pictures and board member, photos and stuff like that off of websites. Like, I don't know if that's ultimately the right long-term solution, but being smart, being really buttoned up, because the threat dynamics are continuing to change, both physical and, kind of digital, are continuing to be a real problem. So that's a different muscle maybe that is being built here over the course of 2026.
Yeah. I think that point on picking up with security officers and having like monitoring in place, even at a fundamental level, has become pretty much like standard procedure. It's been surprising to us to see the increasing negative increase of content on social platforms, specifically on X, over the last few years that we've been doing this study. Across the board, most like mainstream media profiles, platforms average around, 15% negative coverage, 18% negative coverage. And the large mass is neutral exposure. On X and Discus and some of these other listserv type environments, for CEOs, that tips into 35-37% negative content. And so monitoring these platforms, understanding sort of commentary out there, what to take seriously, what to sort of ignore, seems like a healthy investment in overall security.
And you're starting to see them sharing monitoring resources as well. So your social team on the corporate communication side and the threat monitoring team on the corporate security side are starting to collaborate at a tactical level as well.
Yeah. So, all right, it's a new world. Our CEOs are navigating. We're doing our best to support them. In your estimation, who do you think a CEO should have on speed dial right now?
Yeah, I think it's clear. I mean, yeah, I'm heavily biased on this because I've done this job, several times. But I do think the CCO role continues to, expand in its scope and its reporting relationship, the number of reporting directly to the CEO and things like that. The number who have moved into this, CCO plus type environment, with picking up government relations, marketing, a number of different functions along the way, because CEOs and frankly even boards are struggling to navigate in this environment. It has gotten more complicated. As I always tell people, they don't teach this stuff in business school typically, and so and yet on a slow Tuesday, it's 10% of a CEO's job, and during a crisis, it's more than half. And so I do think you are seeing, signs in the marketplace that these roles, the creation of more chief corporate affairs officer roles, you are seeing more of this type of empowerment of these functions. Is one of the commentators in this area told me at a conference a few months ago, like, you all do sort of look like the dog that caught the bus, because we've wanted this responsibility. We wanted to be on speed dial, but what do you do with it when you catch the bus? But I do think we are uniquely suited as a function to help CEOs navigate in uncertain waters. The finance people are going to only be able to do so much. The HR people are going to only be able to do so much. We don't want the lawyers doing too much in this space. Your jobs are uniquely suited for this. And so I think it has the opportunity to be a moment of great, kind of advancement for our profession, which I think is exciting.
Great. All right. Well, I know we covered a lot of different ground across the impact index findings, but we would love to hear questions, feedback, other adds and builds to the conversation so far.
I did see one here in the chat, Sarah. I'm not sure if you're seeing that one as well. You're a data nerd, but
yeah, sure. Let me take a look.
Yeah, it's Katerina saying, I'm surprised to see construction, energy, and building in the positive kind of gains territory, not what they're seeing in their region. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, thank you, Katerina. It's a good question, and it was interesting because I would say over 2024, what we saw was that those industries and sectors that had momentum had really strong transformation narratives, and whether that was sort of reimagining global supply chains or rethinking digital transformation or whatever. The industries that tended to have momentum upward with CEOs rising in visibility had a strong transformation narrative. This period of time was unusual in that it was not so much what was helping those rise, but what was pulling others down. And that's what we were talking about, those CEOs that had a public tangle with new policy changes or differences in opinion and net impacts that hurt their customers. Saw that strong pull downward. And so some of those industries that maybe didn't fare as well, but didn't have a public dispute, saw a lift above. So my guess is that would be sort of what was driving that growth specifically.
We got another one here from Carly on the strategy side. Given CEOs should be a bit more focused and not have such a broad stroke when it comes to topics, forums, et cetera, what are the best factors to consider when thinking about what and where they should be discussing? You want to start with that one? Because there's some stuff in the report that I think is pretty cool.
I love this question because, what the data tells us is that there's a clear differentiation between those CEOs who occupy sort of the very top of the Fortune 500, right? The biggest companies in the world, and those that are maybe in the middle or lower, but have a very large and outsized ranking on the index. And what we see is that the CEOs at the top are in a position where they're trying to talk about everything. It's a sweeping commentary across so many different conversations. And they're just more than anything trying to mitigate risk and minimize like conflict. And whereas those CEOs that sort of punch above their weight have a really clear and specific area of focus on thought leadership. And they've carved out, an area to really own a space. In previous years, we saw Larry Fink. BlackRock is not a Fortune 50 company. It ranks much lower, but the impact of that thought leadership initiative that he led saw very large impact scores across the board. And so, I think that this thought leadership events nexus needs to be the foundation of an effective CEO communication strategy in 2026. And in order to really make an impact, you can't boil the ocean and talk about everything. Find a lane, find a specific space for ownership, for impact that is authentic and ownable, and stay focused on that. The right stakeholder audiences, the right forums, the right communities that are really going to engage with this topic.
I think that's right. And the other thing I think about in this space as well is kind of like, what is your role in your industry, right? There's only X number of us that are working with the Jamie Dimons or the Mark Benioffs of the world, almost like the celebrity CEOs. But also, you think about the different role that say a McDonald's or a Walmart plays in their industry versus, a lot of other players in the industry. And so how are you maximizing within the portfolio or the sort of envelope that you have? So if you're the industry leader, you're probably getting pulled into conversations you don't necessarily want to be part of all the time. And so this is a choicefulness strategy. Whereas if you're maybe the more insurgent challenger brand, you may want to think about showing up in some different unexpected places or doing some things like that to try to raise awareness, because you're not carrying all that weight of the industry leadership role. We've got a question. I think Pat's going to come off mute and is coming up next.
Okay, thanks very much. Really appreciate you doing this. In terms of the index and employee communications, what have you seen change from, for example, a few years ago during COVID or the previous administration when it was, much more employee centric? What are you seeing now in terms of effectiveness in getting the message out, but at the same time avoiding the kind of overexposure that you've highlighted?
Yeah, Pat, it's a great question. And I will say the 8 dimensions of the CEO Impact Index rely on equally available, accessible public information. And so employee engagement specifically is one of the hardest dimensions to study, because most employee sentiment data is gathered and captured internally and not shared. And so we're relying on a couple of useful sources that give us a strong signal. Number one, overall best employer rankings. And we can see that those companies that, have strong local ambassadors that say this is a great place to work, kind of ladder up to belief in their CEOs. In addition, Glassdoor has specifically a CEO rating metric, and there are other online sources also that get us sort of close to an overall employee sentiment score. What I can say is that overall, the scores in 2025 seem to be lower than we've seen in 2023 and 2024. It's definitely a moment of rethink, right, on workforce, what do you call it, in the office, sort of, these new models, and it's all playing out. We did check to see if some of those CEOs who have been very vocal about return to office and sort of more stringent workforce policies saw a net impact. Some of those guys appeared, or men and women appeared in the super negatives, but not all of them. And those ones that did appear in the super negative list also had other things that were driving that negative sentiment. So it's a long-winded way of saying that this is a hard space for us to evaluate, but overall, we see that the employee engagement score is a hard one right now. And those CEOs that managed to rise to the top, and we also look at what we call the unicorns. There's 21 CEOs who have above average scores in every single 8 of the dimensions. They take a very even and measured approach and think through all of the stakeholder audiences, including workforce. And so whether that's regular communications internally, but also using LinkedIn and other tools to make sure that they are not ignoring this important constituency, tend to sort of overall lift and rise.
Pat, I think too, and I think this is consistent with the data that Sarah's talking about, that I do think one of the unwritten challenges that we're all dealing with right now is the idea we've got 4 generations in the workforce at the same time. In the two, the boomer and Gen X folks tend to receive information and process information and have expectation of leadership communications that are a little more adjacent to each other. And then, the millennial and I guess Gen Z populations now are a little more alike with each other in terms of their expectations. But I think the days of and I literally on the plane this morning, I was just looking at a book that's going to be coming out next year that gets into a little bit of this. But the days of like I said, you do management are really, do those CEOs still exist? Yeah. But I think CEOs and companies, organizations are learning that so much more of this now is a two-way street. Do your employees have opportunities to see you, get in your head a little bit? Are you more accessible to them, even if it's through things like LinkedIn or other types of tools like that? But also, do you have good listening channels, not just good, kind of content distribution channels, because they want to know that they're heard and they're taken seriously. So I do think all of us are having to move from that paradigm of what the boss said. It was clearly stated in the fourth paragraph, the memo that the big boss put out, that's maybe not sufficient for the types of challenges we're dealing right now, where we're competing with these for people's attention span, even our own employees.
Thank you.
I think Emily also has a question.
Not getting off mute. Yes, thank you. And I feel like it's a little bit related to kind of using CEOs and the focus on internal comms. It's a little bit broad. I have seen in my organization at Russell Reynolds where, everybody's experiencing the churn and the uncertainty and the many priorities and AI disruption. We have seen a need for just really back to basics communications for our CEO, things that are strategic, just trying to keep people focused, that we're really thoughtful about how we use him. So my question is, we've really been, I'm wondering if other people are experiencing that, or if you're seeing that with your clients, because if there's something, there's something else going on, I'd like to be challenged by what I'm doing.
Right,
Sarah, I can jump in on that one unless you want to. Good to see you, Emily. I think this is one of those. This is one of those fun, interesting. What is it? May you have the fortune of living in interesting times. Types of moments. And again, I just think the traditional way that we've used our leadership teams to communicate is just not sufficient to the task anymore. So I know, my last 2 CCO stops, we made big bets. I'm not hawking product here, but Axio Smart Brevity, that model of very lean and kind of this is what we're saying, this is why it matters, this is this is what you need to know, because the traditional memo that we all torture ourselves with, writing and getting clearance and getting legal and HR and whatever else to sign off on it, no one's reading the 4th paragraph anymore. And so I do think there's a lot of having to rework and rewire. I don't even like using the term internal communications. By the way, I think internal communications is a subset of kind of employee engagement, because employee engagement can be, your LinkedIn channel may be one of your most effective tools for rallying, your own team members, and them seeing that in the outside world kind of validates, almost like a form of third-party validation, that what you're saying inside is also what you're telling other stakeholders. I think about the way Walmart uses Doug McMillan's social feed. Take a look at that. I mean, it's the employees are the audience. It's not investors. It's not customers. It's very much an employee-centric platform. So I just think thinking a little differently about that paradigm, and again recognizing these massive generational gaps in terms of how people like receiving and processing information and what type of leadership styles they respond to. I think we all need to meet people halfway on this stuff.
It makes total sense. Yes, the shorter the better. But
yeah,
I've found that it also needs to be just pretty basic, trustworthy, clear stuff right now.
Yeah.
And look, if you're in this mode where you've got the rote CEO memo that comes out every Friday, your click rate's going to go down if it's not saying
For
something useful. And so again, I just think kind of helping people cut through the noise, and presenting them information in a way that, you know, your audience isn't the boardroom for this stuff. When you're talking to your frontline employees or whatever else, it's like, what do you need? Why do you need 2 minutes of my time to digest this information today? What's in it for me? And we've got to, just because it was handed down from the C-suite, it's carved on stone tablets, doesn't mean the frontline employees are going to want to treat it that way.
Great. For sure. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, Sarah and Brian, nice to see you both, and thanks for doing this. Brian, by the way, I'll note, we noticed Doug McMillan at Walmart also used his social feed to introduce Walmart's Thanksgiving meal package for this year. So
Yeah.
they're taking good advantage of the connection he has with audiences. I really appreciate the focus and sort of call for precision communications here. I think that makes a lot of sense at this moment. I'll just note, you know, at Kroger, we're in an interesting spot this year. I feel like Sarah, your material, you know, could have been a case study on our company, because we lost a long sitting CEO at the beginning part of the year. We have an interim, you might call him rescue CEO currently, as we're looking for a permanent and somebody who's decidedly not a celebrity CEO. The kind of cone of retreat insight rang really true for the way we have approached this year in light of those changes. There was a Harvard Business Review story maybe a month or two ago that had a great term. They talked about strategic hibernation. And that is it's a great way to think about the way we've approached this year in this kind of unique interim position where, you know, strategic hibernation does not mean standing still. It actually means sort of like rooting it back in and building quietly and aligning, in our case, the business deeply to kind of prepare yourself to reemerge maybe when conditions are better. The context of that story was very much the Trump administration and as we're sort of navigating that. But I think it applies for where we are. So, you know, our aim has been to control exposure and really understand the political risk landscape and be very disciplined in what we say and how we say it when we believe, you know, we have an opportunity. One other quick thing I'll just note, your comment at the end, Brian, about the CCO and Chief Security Officer connectivity. I think that's also been very true in our experience, especially this past year. The one little kind of fine point I put on it is I think that relationship you mentioned, like kind of joint monitoring. So, you know, our safety and security team has their own social media monitoring, which on one hand is terrific. On the other hand is they need us to make sense of things for them, because so it's like the sense making role of the CCO is so critical in that moment, because they will see stuff and they will send it to senior officers and everybody freaks out and they don't understand that something was sort of meant as a joke. It wasn't real, or, you know, they're missing like social context that kind of helps put things in the right perspective. So I think that's another place where our role and our team's role is so critical.
Those collaborations are happening, and you're right. There is a little bit of there's a little bit of oil and water to start, you know. But you know, frankly, you know, we're seeing examples of where, you know, that they often have access to budget pools that maybe we don't always have on the corporate communication side. So there might be some efficiency collaboration opportunities there to pull some resources and get the, you know, supercharge the monitoring capabilities, but without the human context that you just talked about, that it can become, you know, kind of the blood pressure raising thing in the C-suite, which is not the place you want to live. And then I think too on political issues, and again, not to plug competitors, although no one no one's better in my hometown than K. Roger. You know, Costco, I thought, did a nice job of sort of not, you know, owning the tariff narrative at a time when maybe some other folks in the industry were taking broadsides with it. And I think it was just about being the customer, you know, champion for the customer and being the champion on cost wherever they could. Yeah, Wall Street, you know, is going to need to hear some more specifics about that. And so you can't tap dance your way out of that forever, but certainly in a lot of the other forums where CEOs and acting CEOs are showing up, I think, trying to make sure that you've always got the customer's back. It's a pretty important, part of success in this environment.
And Keith, I just want to say thank you for sharing your perspective. We definitely looked at your industry specifically in this window of time as you suffered the brunt of so many of like these policy shifts. Two things, like number one, I would just say on the cone of retreat, I think where we netted is just that silence is really not an option. And I only say this because in the context of lowering top tier engagement, but rising social echo chamber chatter, when you completely withdraw, you're giving free space to that narrative and that reputation to be set in conversations that you're not even a party of and don't want to be a part of. And so some strategic engagement, at least with trusted, neutral, verified news sources, is well worth the investment in time. And also, I would just say, so like everybody else, we are quickly using AI to make us smarter, faster, and more intelligent. And what our tools are telling us from the research, this surprised me, is that in the face of these attacks, and particularly for new leaders, there is definitely a net opportunity cost to stay quiet for too long. And it's that the longer you stay long, the longer it's harder to dig out from that lower perception score. And so that 90-day window is really important to form an opinion, change the narrative, get the message out that you want to do in order to like look ahead 12 months, 2 years down the road and see a net impact.
So they had a couple of comments, but I don't know if there were questions kind of in the chat. I love Jennifer's, employees spend 9 seconds reading internal emails, and even C-suite officers don't always have high open rates. I mean, I think that's the environment we're living in right now. I think Axios, if you read their book, I think they say it's like you got 12 seconds to set the hook, or else people flip to the next thing. So that's where we are. And we can all bemoan that that's not great and people aren't doing long form thinking or whatever else, and that's fine, but we're living in a TikTok world.
Yeah.
And that's only going to accelerate as, more, Gen Y, Gen Z, I guess I've got alphas in my family. So when they're running the world, it's going to be fast.
On social, I would just say, like speaking of like the fast paced, like high velocity, one thing that we saw is that either CEOs commit to it and they get all the net benefits of the engagement, or it's better to not do it at all. Sort of like a middling, sort of random engagement on LinkedIn actually can be more of a distraction and a waste of time than it is a net benefit. And so either get on it and commit to posting updates, engaging with your community, like having a point of view, or pass.
I'd just like to thank you guys for the observation about AI, the CEOs who spoke out about how they were working with AI and workforce transformation and the people's role in that versus those who are just announcing layoffs, which seem to be aimed more at the investor audience than anything else. Oh, we're getting rid of lots of people, without explaining what the heck or why. I was stunned by some of those announcements, and I think your finding on that was really helpful.
And there was even an article, I want to say it was in the Journal, that was right around the time there was that spate of like 2 or 3 weeks, maybe around the spring earnings call season, where it was like, it was something like, CEOs are now celebrating layoffs, I think was some version of the title of the article. And I just think, it's one thing to say that we've made this difficult decision or that we think we're going to get some efficiencies or things like that. But I think the celebrating of it, and Sarah can keep me honest on this, but I just think that's going to have bad downstream consequences. It may be great on the day of your earnings call with that audience, but at a minimum, it's institutional poison for your employee base. And so if you don't have to say things like that, I wouldn't necessarily be celebrating it.
Yep, definitely. The perception data is showing like a clear distinction between those two things. And I think we're only going to see an acceleration of those types of announcements. So the human piece is really an essential part of the communication strategy. Well, we are so thankful for your time and your feedback. We will be distributing the full report. And as always, the intention of this research is to make us smarter, more informed, better equipped in these CCO roles and communications roles. So if you have feedback or questions of how we could make our data even stronger, we would welcome the feedback. Thank you very
And stay
much.
tuned for the next iteration in the spring, right? You got every 6 months. It'll be really interesting to see, if there's been some sort of stabilization or normalization of the volumes and things like that. So stay tuned in the spring.
Thank you everyone for joining, and huge thank you to Sarah and Brian for sharing with us today. Have a great
Thanks for
day,
having us.
everybody. Yep.
Thanks,
Have a
everybody.
good afternoon.
Thank
you.